Good morning, everyone. People like to complain about big centralized network services like Facebook, Twitter, Amazon.com. And there's some pretty serious issues with having network services be structured that way and using network services that are structured that way. And even worse, those problems become larger as more people use the same centralized network services. So I want to talk a little bit about what those issues are and what the alternatives are to using that sort of network service. How else can network services be structured so that we avoid some of the problems? I want to start with Twitter as an example. And over here, we've got a screenshot of Twitter at its absolute best. We have a tweet from a dog. Twitter is a centralized internet service. That means that a single company runs it, and the corporate hierarchy of that company rules Twitter in the same way that a king rules a monarchy. Whatever they decide is the policy with some limitations, but not much. And a lot of the popular services that people use to communicate and cooperate work that way. Facebook, Amazon, Discord, Reddit, all of the services from Google, including Gmail and YouTube. These are all centralized internet services. And this sort of system is really good for the company that's running it. They own the site, they're in control, they can make whatever decisions they want without needing to even ask users what they would prefer. Now, it may be that they can get users mad, but once one service gets ahead in users, it's really hard to compete with them due to the network effect. Now, the network effect is an extremely powerful effect where for some services, especially these ones where there are multiple users and the users interact, most of the value from the service is not any property of the service itself, it's from the other users using the service. Nobody would use Twitter if people weren't on there. No one would use Facebook if their friends weren't using Facebook. No one would use YouTube if people weren't posting videos on YouTube. But that results in the situation where once one service has a lot of users and is established, starting up another service to compete with them is really difficult. And that is made even worse by the fact that these services tend to intentionally build in lock-in techniques that are intended to prevent users from being able to switch over to other platforms. So even if you launch a competing service to Twitter that is objectively better in any technical metric, lets you post 5 more characters and slightly bigger photos or whatever, nobody's going to use it because all the users are on Twitter and they don't move over because all the users are on Twitter. Now, it's possible for a big network service to be replaced by another one. If you start a Twitter competitor at exactly the same time when Twitter is going to be down for a month because of technical issues, you might be able to become the new Twitter, and if you're better, you're better, but if you're worse, you're worse. Once you've replaced Twitter, you're then the dominant player in that centralized service space, and then Twitter will never be able to compete. We saw this happen with the transition from MySpace to Facebook, the transition from Dig to Reddit. There can be only one. Centralized services like this have some pretty big issues. The first problem is that there is no privacy. The admins have access to all the data that is entered into the service by anyone. And in some cases, the admins of the service will claim encryption or something. We see this with WhatsApp, the messaging service that I think is owned by Facebook. They put a lot of PR effort into saying that they do end-to-end encryption, but we can't rely on that unless we can see the source code and there aren't automatic updates. And for these big centralized services, they're mostly not interested in sharing their source code, and there's no way they're going to turn off automatic updates because they can't really run a system that big without knowing that the end users are going to be on the latest version of the software. So, I mean, and for the longer story on this, go ahead and watch my videos on the Snowden leaks, and then watch the video that I did on the LavaBit shutdown back around the same time as the Snowden leaks. Big companies cannot provide you with any sort of privacy if you give them your data, and small companies cannot provide you with any sort of privacy if you give them your data. Now, the second problem with these big network services is that they have control, and eventually they will use that control. Google search results are tuned to the benefit of Google. Facebook filters what posts you see, and they do it to benefit Facebook. In the case of Facebook, they actually have the PR team in on testing the filters to make sure that if there's a story that's good for Facebook, more people see it. And if there's a story that's really ugly and bad for Facebook, it's not going to propagate as well on Facebook. Amazon promotes their products above those of external sellers. You go start to be a third-party seller on Facebook, you get popular, and Amazon will come in with a Amazon Basics version of your product and list it before yours. One example of a centralized network service that's been around for a while is credit card companies, and they do this all the time. They recently were in the news for blocking payments to porn websites. And if you look into that in some detail, you can see that it is just an example of them abusing their power. They're doing it as the result of a big PR campaign for political reasons, but all of these things, when we're talking about centralized services at this scale, the things that they do are the results of politics. It doesn't make sense to interpret them any other way. Now, back to Twitter. Twitter once banned the sitting president of the United States from their service after he had come to rely on them as a way to disseminate his public statements. Now, that guy was an asshole, but one private business having the level of administrative discretion to muzzle any government official, much less the president of the United States, is kind of crazy. The problem isn't even necessarily the ban. Sure, companies can ban people from their services as long as they are really acting as private entities. And the problem here with Twitter is that they are so dominant that when they banned the president of the United States from their service, it mattered. And there shouldn't be network services that big just from a social hygiene perspective. Society is kind of broken when Twitter has the power to control how well the president of the United States can communicate with the public. Now, a third problem here is that centralized services are a fragile thing to depend on. If your business relies on Amazon, and then either Amazon goes down for some reason or they ban your account, then your business is probably over. And if you're not relying on centralized services in that way, and I mean, business is the obvious example, but relying on things in person is similar. If you're relying on Gmail for your email, and then your Google account gets banned, you're having a real bad day, even if you're not using it for business. Suddenly, you can't apply for jobs anymore because your email is down until you go reset up your whole life. So that raises the question, what is the alternative here to big centralized services? And one alternative is federation. So we're talking about Twitter as our big example, and an alternative to Twitter is having a bunch of little Twitters. And how can that work? The big advantage that Twitter has is the network effect, where the more users who are on Twitter, the more valuable Twitter is to the world. But we use a service all the time where the network effect doesn't quite work in that way, and that service is email. So if you use a big centralized service for email like Gmail, that doesn't force everyone you know that doesn't force everyone you know to also use that same service, because email works between different sites. Email is a federated service. Google can run a big email service, but I can just as easily run a small email service. Well, not quite as easily. Running email is obnoxious, but it's possible for me to run a small email service. I do run my own email. And from the small email server I run, I can communicate with people on Google. I can communicate with people who are still using old Yahoo Mail. I can communicate with people using Microsoft's Outlook.com. I can communicate with people using their own personal email services. And I can communicate with all the numerous small businesses and organizations that still run medium-sized email services. So that's great. There's a standardized protocol where the email servers can communicate with each other, and email addresses say, who are you sending the email to, and then where is the email server. If you have bob@gmail.com, then Bob is the user and gmail.com is the server. If you have sally@eff.org, then Sally is the user and eff.org is sufficient information to go find the server. Just looked up through DNS. The whole internet infrastructure is built to allow this sort of, the whole internet infrastructure is built specifically to make sure that email works. We can think of the web as being federated as well. Everyone can run their own web server, but the web doesn't have to deal with communication in quite the same way. You're always requesting information from the web, whereas with email, you have to be able to push messages to other people. So Twitter and email look awfully similar. All it would take in order to make Twitter federated is to have a protocol that allows you to send microblog messages to other servers and have things properly propagate and be connected. And people have built that. There's a protocol called ActivityPub that allows people to run small microblogging servers and have them communicate with each other. The most well-known and most popular implementation of this ActivityPub protocol is called Mastodon, which I have up over here, but there's a couple other implementations of it. For example, Pleroma, I think that's how you say that, also provides a Twitter-style microblogging interface, and Mastodon and Pleroma will interoperate. If you are a user on a Mastodon server, you can microblog with a mention at someone on another server. You just say @bob@example.com, and @bob is the user, just like a Twitter user. But then we also have this @example.com piece, which is that's a domain name. It gives us the routing information that we need to get to the appropriate ActivityPub server to send the message through. Now, ActivityPub is a little bit more powerful than Twitter is, so we can do other things. Another centralized network service that exists is Instagram, where people post photos, and an implementation of photo microblogging over ActivityPub exists in the form of PixelFed. And PixelFed interoperates with Mastodon and Pleroma. So you can think that you're doing photo blogging, and you can be followed by or follow people who think that they're doing microblogging, and everything just works together great. And with this sort of federation, this solves the network effect problem to some extent, because anybody who's trying to compete with email doesn't just need to compete with Gmail. They need to compete with the combined network effect of every email server. Similarly, somebody who wants to compete with the sort of ActivityPub ecosystem has to compete with every Mastodon server, every Pleroma server, and every PixelFed server with their new centralized service or their new federated service in order to take over. So that's great, but that raises the question, is joining a Mastodon server really better than joining Twitter? And I'd like to say yes, but there's a pretty big problem with especially social networking built as a federated system. The problem is there are still admins. And it turns out that it matters who the admins are for it always matters who the admins are, but for communication, it matters a lot who the admins are. Now, you end up with this choice of, you can either have the admins be random people that you don't really know, or you can have them be people you know relatively well. Do you want your admin to be some guy who was hired by Jack Dorsey, who doesn't really care that you exist and probably isn't going to put any effort into bothering you unless you do something that gets people to make really loud noises about you. Unless you're doing something that's really making a lot of people mad, Twitter's not going to ban you. On the other hand, if you have a federated microblogging account with Moe's Tavern, if you get Mo mad, he's going to ban you. He's going to kick you out of his bar and ban you from the social networking server. And so that's one problem. If you have a small social networking service, you have sort of local interpersonal politics to deal with. But the other problem is that you have to pick which local server that you're going to deal with, which small server is appropriate. If you sign up for the Moe's Tavern microblogging server, then if you decide that you want to start, if you want to give up drinking and you don't go to the tavern anymore and you don't want to talk to a bunch of drunks, then that account is useless and you sort of lose all your history when you move over to, I don't know, your knitting microblogging account. And if you start to think about who would want to run a microblogging account, this politics gets even more obnoxious. Who would want to run a microblogging service? Who wants to run a federated server on this sort of network? Do you want to join the one for your family that's run by your mother-in-law? Maybe not. Do you want to join one for your local political party? Do you really want to be Bob at mittromney2012.com? That's not going to last that long. Do you want to join one for your employer? You're not necessarily going to work for them forever. Do you want to join one for your union? That's basically the same as joining one for your employer, except the political implications are a little bit different. Now, sort of the best option for joining a microblogging service ends up being trying to pick some random person who probably doesn't disagree with you on something, but the result of that tends to be topic-oriented servers. So, do you want to join something run by a random dude from New York who's really into baseball because you're also really into baseball? Well, maybe. But you have to worry about admins, whereas when you sign up for a big centralized network service, it feels impersonal. It feels like you're getting a utility, not a relationship. And utilities are way easier to deal with than relationships. Now, even if you do find a federated server that works for you, that only reduces the issues with the centralized service. It doesn't get rid of them. So you still have admins, and that means you still need to worry about the same problems as with the centralized service: privacy, control, and reliability. And privacy might be better or it might be worse. It depends. Do the admins want to snoop on your private messages? Probably the Twitter admins don't want to bother snooping on your private messages, but they're definitely going to feed them all in bulk to the US government. What's the trade-off? Hard to tell. Do you have someone you personally know working at Twitter? They're more likely to go look at your messages. Control is more likely to be abused by a small service, but it's also less of a problem. There's still a control issue with smaller services, but it's nowhere near as big. There's no situation where ilovepuppies.social is going to ban the president of the United States, and that's going to be a big issue. With Twitter, that happened. And reliability is almost certainly going to be better with the giant centralized service because they can afford to have a bunch of admins to try to keep it up as frequently as possible. On the other hand, if a single federated server goes down, it only affects a small number of people. So the entire network doesn't go down in that case. So reliability for you might be worse. Reliability overall might be better. It's hard to really evaluate which is like purely better. There are trade-offs. The big problem with centralized social networks that doesn't get solved by moving to a federated system is the trustworthiness of admins. Admins have power over the system, and that power means a potential for abuse as long as the power exists at all. So that raises the question, can we get rid of admins entirely? Is it possible to build a fully decentralized internet service? And it turns out that it is absolutely possible to do that. But it is a difficult problem in general. Decentralized services, decentralized network architectures are one of the things that's sort of an open research problem in computer science. It's not easy. It's been an open research problem for decades. Now, centralized and federated services avoid a bunch of problems that can't be avoided in a decentralized system. For example, in a decentralized system, it's impossible to guarantee unique names. If you sign up for Twitter as Bob57, then Twitter can determine if someone had that handle before. If you try to get it after someone else has gotten it, they can say no. If someone comes along after you get it and tries to impersonate you with the same handle, Twitter can just say no. If there's no central server and no admins, then if I come along and say I'm Bob57 and you come along and say you're Bob57, then the only possible outcome is that we are both now calling ourselves Bob57, and we have to have some mechanism to make it so that I can't impersonate you other than saying that we have to have unique names. Now, the good news is that there's a reasonably well-established, fully decentralized social networking system. This system is called Secure Scuttlebutt. Now, Secure Scuttlebutt isn't a perfect system, but it demonstrates solutions to some of the major issues with any of the more centralized solutions. Secure Scuttlebutt does not in any way rely on admins or mandatory centralized servers at all. This Secure Scuttlebutt protocol was developed by a guy who liked to spend a lot of time offline. When I say offline, I mean really offline. He liked to be out on the ocean in a sailboat where there was no connectivity whatsoever. So the design of this system is such that it can work without internet connectivity. Users make posts locally on their devices, be that their phone or their laptop, and then the posts are synced to other users with the primary mode that it was designed to work in, that users are synced directly to another user's device. So I make a post on my laptop, I bring my laptop to my friend's house, she opens up her laptop, both our laptops are running at the same time, and over either the local area network, shared Wi-Fi, shared LAN, or over Bluetooth, if we're close enough together and both have that turned on, we will sync posts. Any post I made offline will go to her machine. Any post she made offline will go to my machine. And this includes distributing posts for friends and friends of friends. So when I meet up with my friend, any posts that had been previously synced to my machine from mutual friends or had previously been synced to her machine from mutual friends will get synced so that everybody can see all of the available posts from their friends on any of the machines that are there. So that means that you can see social networking posts from people that you haven't seen recently in person, as long as your natural social network has connected out and there's a path that the post can travel over. This does mean that this is not a real-time system at all. That was not the design goal. The design goal was that eventually messages would get to all the places that they're supposed to go, as long as people use the software and meet up. Now, Secure Scuttlebutt also has mechanisms for syncing over the internet. It has support for direct peer-to-peer connections coordinated through a distributed hash table. So if you hook up to the network and other people are also hooked up to the network and firewalls are working out properly, the nodes can connect up to each other directly and exchange messages. That's extremely powerful. But there's another mechanism called pubs. A pub is an instance of the Secure Scuttlebutt software that's run as a server. It's always connected to the internet, and it has its own identity that doesn't represent a real human. So you can be friends with a pub. You can follow a pub the same way that you can follow a person. And then the standard mechanism of syncing happens, where you send messages that you posted to the pub, and you download messages from the pub that friends posted who had previously shared it with the pub. And so the pub acts as a mechanism for the sort of natural social network connections to be enhanced by having always-on nodes. And if a pub disappears, everything still works. If you add a new pub, everything still works. So while the pubs have admins, they don't have all that much power. All they can do is say, like, who gets invited to join the pub. But if you don't get invited to join one pub, you can just go run your own pub or not use a pub at all. It's fine. The other thing that pubs do is they provide a mechanism where you can discover new people. So if you are connected to a pub and someone who isn't your friend is also connected to the pub, you're both following that pub. So you act as friends of friends. And so you'll see some posts from these people in your feed if you look for people that you aren't friends with. The software generally gives you the ability to look at a view that's just like people that you're following or everybody that you happen to have messages from. And so this doesn't expose you to like the entire global internet, but it does expose you to people who are probably friends of friends of friends. Or if you joined a public pub, there are a few public pubs. If you joined a public pub, you'll just see random people from all over the world who also join the same public pub, but not a giant number of them. And that leads into one of the things that's actually really nice about the secure scuttlebutt network setup, and that is the story on moderation and harassment. You'd expect that with this sort of completely decentralized network service with no real admins at all, there would be jerks on the internet. And there's a limitation to that. There's no searchable global public identity here. So there's no way to go track down somebody's secure scuttlebutt handle and then send them messages. You're only connected to someone if you follow them, or if they follow a friend or a friend of the friend, or if they're on the same pub. And the standard thing for pubs is that they're generally small and usually are invitation only. So the result is that we don't end up with the standard social atmosphere of the normal public internet. We end up with what feels like a smaller, less obnoxious community. And if there are obnoxious people and you see posts from them, you can block them. And you can block them either publicly, saying, I don't want to get relayed messages from these people at all, or you can block them privately, and your client just won't show you those messages. It's like you get to do your own personal shadow ban of this person. And if you have a friend or a pub that keeps following obnoxious people, so you have to constantly be blocking people because your person that you're following wants to see stuff that you don't want to see, you can just stop following that person or pub that is the problem, and you'll only see posts from people that you're interested in seeing posts from. Connections are opt-in. That's all great, but it's not perfect. This protocol does have two critical problems. The first problem is that the protocol, in the structure of the protocol, explicitly doesn't support using a single identity across multiple devices. You can't have the same account on your phone and on your computer. This protocol runs locally on your devices. There is no server. So if you install a secure scuttlebutt client on your phone, you generate an identity on that phone, and that is that identity. If you install a thing on your computer, you'll generate an identity on the computer, and then if you have a phone and a computer, you have two identities. There's no way to fix it. There's no way to combine them. That's obnoxious. It's not quite as bad as it sounds, and the standard solution seems to be just you try to limit the number of different devices you're using it on, and you have to get all the people that you want to have follow your different identities. The second problem is that all posts are public and signed. And it'd be nice to be able to post to sort of specific groups of friends, the way most social networks let you do that, and therefore have control over how your posts are going to be propagated. And then to have the post that you're making be deniable. We have this concept of non-repudiation in messaging systems, and it's a property that's nice in some circumstances and not nice in other circumstances. And for social networks, having having like a secure digital signature on everything that you ever post so that there's like strong evidence that you really made the post. So if someone digs up an old post from years ago, like it has your signature on it, that's not great. Now there is support for private messages in the sort of direct messaging sense, but that's not quite the same thing as being able to do broadcasts to limited groups, and private messages are also signed. That being said, both of those issues are pretty easily solved with backwards incompatible changes to the protocol or a new protocol, and so Secure Scuttlebutt is still like most of the way there to being a really good decentralized social networking protocol. Now, where I'm going with this is that I'd like to do some testing with Secure Scuttlebutt. And specifically, I'd like to try to get a better understanding of how the identity model ends up working with people who I can't meet in person to set up local follows. So I've set up a public, I've set up an SSB pub server. If you'd like to join me, go ahead and click in the link in the description of this video to the blog post associated with this, and scroll down to the bottom where I say to the testing Secure Scuttlebutt header, and follow the instructions there. You'll have to install an SSB client, and then there's an invite link there that will let you join my pub. And once you join up, go ahead and make a post mentioning me using the user account that's also in that blog post. The syntax to do a mention should be down there, at least for some of the clients. The software ecosystem here is sort of awkward. There's a bunch of different clients, none of which are super well maintained. The two that I've tested that definitely work are Oasis for desktop and Manyverse for Android. It's available on F-Droid. But in any case, if you're interested in playing with this, go ahead and join my pub server and make a post mentioning me. And as usual, go ahead and click the link in the description to get to my blog, subscribe to the RSS feed so that you don't miss anything that I post, regardless of how algorithms work or what platforms exist or anything like that. And yeah, have a great rest of your day.